Good evening and welcome to Metro Focus. I'm Rafael P. Roman. In what some are calling a stunning upset, Alabama, the reddest of red states, elected its first Democrat to the U.S. Senate in 25 years last night. Doug Jones defeated Republican Roy Moore, an always controversial candidate who became even more controversial after a number of women accused him of sexual misconduct that happened decades ago when they were in their teens and he was in his 30s. Most Republican senators and many Republican Congress members distanced themselves from Moore, some publicly calling for him to step down. Nevertheless, over the last days of the campaign, the Republican National Committee once again began supporting Moore after having previously cut its ties to him, and President Trump vigorously endorsed and campaigned for the candidate. What impact is all of this likely to have on the 2018 midterm elections? And beyond that, what impact will it have on the Republican Party brand across the country and here in New York State? And with the Republican majority in the Senate now reduced to 51, how will Doug Jones' victory affect the Trump agenda? Joining us now to answer these and other questions is Republican political strategist Joseph Pinion. He is the founder and chairman of the Conservative Color Coalition and the outreach director for New York Young Republicans. Joseph, thanks for talking to us today.
Good to be here.
So Joseph, are Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans breathing a sigh of relief today because they lost the Alabama election?
Well, in a word, yes. I think that on some basic level, you cannot underestimate what an unmitigated disaster it would have been to have Roy Moore in the Senate. Having said that, I think that there is still damage that has been done. And so that is just the kind of the brutal reality that all Republicans are going to have to face moving forward and the reckoning that we're going to have to deal with.
Talk about the damage that's been done. How is the whole Roy Moore controversy likely to affect the 2018 midterm elections?
Look, I think that the day that the President of the United States decided to hop on Air Force One and fly down to the Panhandle, Pensacola, to campaign on behalf of a man with credible accusations of child molestation against him, and then basically instructed the RNC to double down on their fundraising efforts on his behalf. Regardless of the outcome of this election, we were going to have Roy Moore campaign ads running through the entirety of the midterms. So, you know.
But he lost. So are they still going to do that?
I think that it's an unavoidable reality that when the President of the United States, the leader of our party, has decided that he is going to, knowing all the facts that were there at that time, still say that, you know what, we're going to actually toss our hat in here with this man, in spite of the incontrovertible evidence in many ways that there was just things here that should not in any way be associated with a party that claims to stand for character and family values. There is no way, it is unavoidable to me, it's inconceivable to me that we're not going to have this hung around our neck, not have this scarlet letter to bear throughout the entirety of the midterms, particularly in districts where Republicans might have some difficulty.
And beyond the midterm elections, how is the Roy Moore controversy going to affect the Republican brand across the country and in blue states like New York?
I think that it will have less of an effect, with the only kind of issue being that if you were a Republican that stood silent, if you were a Republican that did not in any way condemn a man who in many ways has credible accusations of the condemnable, trying to, again, take advantage of childhood innocence. If you were someone who somehow thought that it was appropriate for the RNC to spend my RNC dollars, any person who's given money to the RNC, from people who wrote a check for $100,000 to people who, bought a coffee mug that said Bush Reagan 84 on it. All those people now in some ways have been made complicit through the actions of the RNC. And so if you were somebody who somehow just were able to turn a blind eye to that the fact that we had in many ways been dragged in to a race that in many ways was the antithesis of what the Republican Party has always claimed to uphold, then I think we're going to have some difficulties. But I think, particularly in places like New York, I think that you saw that there were individuals across the spectrum of the Republican Party that were able and willing to stand up and say that this is not something that we ought to be doing.
Are Democrats now seeing a weakened Donald Trump as a result of this loss in Alabama? And are they going to go after him even more vigorously, especially on, for example, the sexual harassment charges against him?
Look, I think that regardless of whether you hate Donald Trump, love Donald Trump, the unfortunate place we're in right now is that we have a president that is burning his political capital at both ends. You have a president that right now, even in a state where he won by over 20 points in Alabama, down to 48% favorability. That is a damning condemnation of any Republican in the state of Alabama, let alone somebody that won by such an overwhelming margin. Somebody where, if we can actually talk about it, whose campaign really gained credibility in the heart of Mobile, Alabama. So I think that it's unavoidable right now to look at the landscape and say that this president right now does not have coattails. This is the president right now that unfortunately has shortened the coattails of the brand as a whole. And so, yeah, there's going to be some trouble there. And I think that, as you can see right now, with the astronomical African-American turnout that happened in Alabama, with the astronomical Democratic turnout that we had in Virginia, when you look at the fact that we had 3 special elections at the state level in Oklahoma, one of the reddest states in the nation, the Democrats were able to win, that we, somehow, I think sometimes Republicans put their head in the sand and try to ignore. There are threads, there are warning signs, harbingers of doom here, kind of all over the place. And so I think that it would be right now as a party to pause and say, do we continue down this path? Or do we make a reassessment now? Do we go back and find that dusty file of the Growth and Opportunity Project that Reince Priebus had drawn up after the 2012 election losses of Governor Romney, and say, let us get back to the data-driven principles and moral-driven principles that we know must be incorporated with the GOP brand if we hope to move forward.
Steve Bannon, the president's former chief strategist, was probably Roy Moore's biggest supporter. What is Moore's laws going to do to Bannon's nationalist economic agenda, and what's it going to do to his declared war against Mitch McConnell and the so-called Republican establishment?
Look, I've often said that this whole Bannon wing idea of the Republican Party has been much overstated. Steve Bannon is not leading any faction of the Republican Party. He's just a man speaking to people who are inclined to to agree with him. And I think that we've seen this before. We've seen candidacies like Roy Moore's before. We've seen the Christine O'Donnell, I'm not a witch, down in down in Delaware. We've seen what happened out in Nevada. We've seen these kamikaze candidates who have held ideas that, yes, may in many ways invigorate, unfortunately, and maybe awaken kind of our lesser angels on the conservative side of the aisle, but ultimately arrive in the general election to find themselves unelectable.
President Trump has had a difficult time getting the Republican majority in the Senate to back his agenda. How is it going to fare now with one less vote?
The greatest obstacle to the Republican agenda thus far, unfortunately, has been the president. So when you look at a president that has gone after Senator Flake, has gone after Senator McCain, has gone after, so many of the individuals that he actually depends on to be able to get legislation passed on a personal level, on a professional level. Those are the type of actions where you say that a president that has claimed and been wanting to say that he wants to unite the country and bring people together, has struggled to even bring Republicans together. And so that is going to be a big struggle for us moving forward, particularly with regards to this agenda.
Well, President Trump's latest war, it was a Twitter war, and it began yesterday against New York Democrat Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from here in New York State. And in his tweets, he called her a lightweight, a total flunky for Senator Schumer. And he wrote that, quote, she would go to his, Trump's, office begging for campaign contributions. They would do anything for them. Now, there's been a lot of blowback to those tweets, specifically that last line, where a lot of people are saying that there was a sexual innuendo in it. What's your take on all this?
I think there's no question that there was some form of inappropriate sexual innuendo, at worst there. At best, the hope you could say is that he's accused a sitting U.S. senator of a quid pro quo. Either way, I think that it is unbecoming of the office of the presidency. I think often if you can get to a situation where you have former Senator Rick Santorum and Elizabeth Warren in agreement on an issue to say that, yes, number one, this was a crass comment made to elicit some form of sexual connotation, and B, that is unbecoming of the President of the United States, then something is happening that is completely out of the context of the normal. And so we just need to address it as such. And, look, I understand on some basic level what happens in the White House and with the press secretary having to, in many ways, hopefully defend the president. But the fact remains that as a party, as Republicans, we cannot continue to put our heads in the sand and say that somehow there's nothing to see here, because if we're going to do that, then we're going to have tremendous difficulties moving forward, trying to move forward with the conservative agenda everywhere from Alabama to here in New York City.
Now, finally, Joseph, the Republicans haven't elected a Republican governor since 2002 when they re-elected Pataki. There's a gubernatorial race going to happen in 2018. Are the Republicans going to put up a serious candidate, and are they seriously going to fund him or her?
Well, I think that we will put up a serious candidate. We have several that have already announced their interest in the race. Everyone from Mark Molinaro to Harry Wilson. These are individuals. Even the minority leader in the assembly, Cobb, a well from upstate. So we have individuals who are serious about running. We have individuals that I think can chart a pathway to victory if they focus on the issues that are crucial to New Yorkers. If they focus on the fact that we have difficulties dealing with MTA here in the city, the difficulties as far as funding. If they focus on the fact that we have infrastructure concerns. If they focus on the fact that we have basic funding concerns with just basic services and unfunded mandates and all the things that truly impact people on a day-to-day basis, things that they talk about at the kitchen table. So I think that yes, it's going to be difficult in 2018 regardless, more so at the federal level, but certainly also at the state level. But I think that with the right candidate, with the right message, there are certainly some vulnerabilities there that can be exploited.
Joseph, thank you so much for talking to us today. We'll see what happens next.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.